Hi everyone, welcome to today's Litmos webinar, laying the foundation for L&D amidst organizational chaos. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us where you're signing in from. We're always curious to see where everyone's logging in from. While we wait for more attendees to trickle in, I'm going to just get started with a couple of housekeeping notes that you'll see on this first slide. So on your webinar console, you'll notice there's a chat window to your right. You can use this chat window to introduce yourselves or to comment on the topics being discussed in today's webinar. And the Q&A window is located just below that chat window. You can use that to send us questions throughout the presentation, and myself and the rest of the Litmos team will do our best behind the scenes to respond to those questions in real time. However, we'll also be saving a couple of questions for a live Q&A portion, which will happen in the last session of the presentation. You can find the slides for this presentation, as well as a link to a free copy of our Create an L&D Blueprint Guide in the resources section at the bottom of your screen in the console. And finally, just a quick reminder that this webinar will be recorded and sent to you via the email that you registered with, so keep an eye on your inboxes. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our host, Dr. Jill Stefaniak, the Chief Learning Officer at Litmos. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to speak with you about a frustrating topic that I think plagues us as L&D professionals, but one that's not going anywhere. And so the purpose of this webinar today is to kind of talk about some of the challenges that we just face naturally as L&D professionals amidst organizational chaos, and try to leave today with some strategies to kind of help navigate those challenges, mitigate some of those challenges along the way. And so as we go through our webinar, we only have a short amount of time with one another this afternoon, but the goal is that you're going to hopefully leave with some ideas for both instructional and non-instructional solutions. When I talk with L&D professionals, I always say the non-instructional solutions are so critical to L&D success, because we could design the best piece of instruction, but if we don't have adequate infrastructure in place, all of those training efforts and initiatives are going to be dead on arrival. And so as we go through today, you'll see we have our construction theme as we're going through, but what do we need to be able to lay a solid foundation to support the work we do as L&D professionals in these dynamic and ever-changing work environments? And so three objectives and three goals that I have for our time together this afternoon, our session blueprint. We're going to define organizational anarchy and talk about its impact on workplace learning. We'll identify some instructional and non-instructional approaches to help stabilize our L&D programs within our organization, regardless of the size of our organization. Organizational anarchy exists in the smallest organizations, those middle-sized ones, as well as those large corporations. And then lastly, hopefully we'll be able to kind of leave today where you'll feel like you can create an action plan to apply some key L&D strategies to support any chaotic events that may be occurring in your work environment. And so before we jump too far into talking about all of the challenges with organizational anarchy, have you ever worked in an environment where leadership felt absent or unclear? And how did it affect your ability to do your job? And so I encourage you just to take a moment and share that in the chat. And if anyone on this call says they've never encountered any challenges, please put in where you work so we can all apply there later on, because I've yet to meet an L&D professional that's been able to avoid organizational anarchy at all costs. Yeah, someone's teasing us already saying never. Yeah. So again, just knowing, are you going in the right direction? You know, where is L&D fitting in within our strategic plans? Where is there unclear leadership? Those are all certain things that absolutely make us feel perhaps a little hesitant and starting to question what's next for some of these initiatives and some of these projects that we may be working on. And so when we look at the messy reality of organizational anarchy, There are three characteristics to organizational anarchy. And so I want you to be thinking about just different L&D projects, because you'll probably say, yep, I've encountered this, or yes, I've encountered that. We have problematic preferences. And so this means that you might have multiple people involved with different goals and objectives. So perhaps you might have a manager or a supervisor that has their own set of goals and initiatives of where their own vision of where they think L&D may be headed within your organization. You might have a changing strategic plan. Maybe there's some organizational changes that are about to take place. And you feel like you might be in a holding pattern trying to see what those changes are going to be before you can implement training or start talking about how L&D may support some of those changes. Depending on your organization, you might struggle to see how does L&D fit into the organization's strategic plan? Does L&D have a place at the table when these types of discussions are occurring? We then have unclear technology. And so when we look at unclear technology, this is where we're starting to see perhaps there's a lack of processes in place to support our efforts or to support some of the changes that may be getting presented, whether it's with new leadership, whether it's with changes in strategic planning. Sometimes we might feel like we're building the plane as we're trying to fly it. And sometimes it's not until we realize that we really needed a policy or protocol to guide what those next steps are that we realize it was missing all along. And so anytime when we have those types of things, we might have a lack of infrastructure. We might not have the technological resources that we need. We might not have the human capital that we need to support some of the initiatives that are being presented to us. Those are all examples of where we see challenges with unclear technology. We also have, the last one here is fluid participation. And this is where we might have where it feels like we've got people coming and going. So you might have subject matter experts that might weigh in for a little bit. You might get some time with them. You might have, you might find that you've got leaders that pop in and out in different departments, sharing their feedback or sharing their comments. You might have changes in leadership where if you were to say, who's, getting involved in this, it's really hard to tell. You might not have people, you might feel like you're dedicated to the project, for the entire duration of whatever that project or initiative is. But you find that there's a lot of, I always call them guest speakers or finale people at the end. They like to come in the beginning and they like to come in at the end to say, look at all the wonderful things we've done. But when you really need them, when you're trying to build something, you're struggling. Those are examples of fluid participation. And I'm sure when you think about from time to time, some of these things happen just naturally, depending on the size of your organization. I don't think organizational leaders ever go into a situation and say, let's make this really difficult for our L&D professionals. But sometimes this happens. I also tell people, and it certainly is not a goal of today where we're going to overcome organizational anarchy. I think it's just inherent in the line of work that we do. And so as you start thinking of it that way, it helps, or at least it helps me to think about what are some of the strategies I might employ to help navigate when I find myself in some of these different challenges and I need some additional assistance from my colleagues or leadership. And so as we're looking at this, some of those characteristics of organizational anarchy. So I want you to be thinking about some different projects you might be working on. Latency in decision making. Perhaps you might have to go up the chain and it feels like a telephone game trying to get approvals for what you're able to do. Perhaps there's changes being done with strategic planning. And again, you might be told, just wait before we launch this next initiative that we have on the calendar or that we've been planning for. Sometimes that leads to conflicting or undefined goals. Sometimes people are leading with a lot of assumptions. They're assuming that you're reading their mind and you know exactly how L&D is going to support organizational goals that haven't been communicated clearly throughout your organization. Or you may find that you have a few different initiatives that kind of contradict or conflict with one another. Sometimes when these things tend to happen is when you have a fragmented or siloed communication. And this can happen, we tend to see it more in larger organizations where there's a lot of different departments, there's a lot of hierarchy. But I also have seen it happen in a lot of smaller organizations too, where, the right hand's not talking to the left hand, or there's different people that are doing similar, they're working on similar tasks and not coming together. And so when this happens, or when it doesn't happen, we can start looking at there may be challenges with ambiguity around roles and responsibilities. Depending on the size of the organization, as L&D professionals, we wear multiple hats at various times. And I know if you're working in a smaller organization, you're probably wearing a whole bunch of hats. And sometimes, depending on the initiatives, or if you're trying something new and they're asking L&D to help and contribute, there may be ambiguity around roles and responsibilities because you had that, we talked about unclear technology, you had a lack of process, you had a lack of protocols to help support this along the way. The other thing to be thinking about is that you may find that you're in a highly reactive environment, and this is where those plans change rapidly. So an example of this could be organizational, your senior organizational leadership changing the strategic plan every 6 months. Or perhaps they're changing it every year, and not really allowing time for people to digest it, to be able to plan, to execute initiatives, give it time to settle, and then measure to see, are we meeting our intended purpose with these organizational goals? If you find that you have leadership that's asking you to do a lot of knee-jerk L&D development, that can also be a challenge where we struggle as L&D professionals. And so why does this happen? As we start thinking about things, we have our structural causes. So this is just those flat hierarchies, rapid expansions, legacy systems. Sometimes, depending on the size of our organization, I'm sure everyone on this call has interacted with someone at some point in time who told you, well, we've always done it this way. And maybe it worked 20 years ago, but maybe a lot of things have changed within that organization. Maybe products and services have changed, departments and units have changed. And so these are all different things that you need to be mindful of as you're going along and kind of navigating how are you going to approach this. We have organizational, cultural causes. Sometimes there's challenges with that lack of accountability, and sometimes it's unintended. Sometimes people are assuming others are working on tasks, not really ever having had a conversation about what's everyone's role going to be. When you look at a lot of the research involving conflict in L&D and conflict in workplace learning, it's because there hasn't been adequate or sufficient communication taking place. And so that's where we tend to see where things start to kind of fall by the wayside. There's not many planning meetings just to even verify and ensure that we all have a shared understanding or a shared agreement of what the goals are and how this relates to L&D, and what the goals are and what's everyone's roles and responsibilities to support that project. Different organizations and different leaders and individual employees, we all have a different tolerance for ambiguity. I can tolerate it a little bit more when I've had to go through similar situations at some point. I'm more open to tolerating ambiguity if I'm dealing with ambiguity, but it's with a group of people I'm somewhat familiar with or I've worked with in the past. But when we have a lot of things that we're not familiar with, or new people coming in, that fluid participation we were talking about on the previous slide, then that can be really challenging and frustrating for us as L&D professionals. We also look at external triggers that can cause organizational anarchy to the best of organizations, regardless of their size. This could be market disruptions. Perhaps your organization is having a change in the types of services and products it may be offering. Mergers and acquisitions, where we're looking at changes in leadership, we're blending companies together, we're differentiating and separating. Again, these are all things that greatly impact that strategic plan and the organizational structure, the hierarchy within your organization. And that, of course, all trickles down to how L&D might be able to support our talent development, just regular professional development, customer training. And of course, leadership changes where different leaders are coming in with different goals and expectations. And so for this next thing here, this next slide is really looking at why L&D needs a blueprint. And so this is where we can kind of start thinking about how we can help ourselves out as L&D professionals when we're finding ourselves in, uncovering or when we find ourselves in the midst of organizational anarchy. And so if we find ourselves that we're dealing with unplanned training delays or cancellations, again, maybe we had the best piece of training, we had a schedule in place, and something changed in the organization, and leadership said, we know we were planning on launching this initiative next week. We need to hold off and wait a little bit until some other things get handled. We may have unpredictable budget cuts. Perhaps we lose a few really key employees supporting this L&D initiative or supporting the organization with how we were going to be supporting it as L&D professionals. Sometimes we find that we might lose learning initiatives in the shuffle of strategic priorities. There's times where organizations might not be thinking right away when they're making changes to their strategic plans about how L&D can have an active role in supporting employees and supporting and facilitating those changes. And that's where I would implore any of you, for those of you that find yourself where you have those opportunities to have a seat at those tables that are making those decisions, or you have good working relationships with those leaders that are in those conversations, this is where it's really helpful to start thinking about how L&D can be involved to set up a sound infrastructure to support those changes, to support your strategic planning and your employee development. We also find that having a blueprint helps us address trainer burnout. Sometimes our trainers get burnt out. Sometimes our L&D developers and instructional designers get burnt out if there's changing priorities and initiatives. And we also have learner disengagement. Learners thrive on consistency. And so when they have too many things are being thrown at them, or they have too much training being thrown at them, and maybe it's training that they don't need, or they're seeing that the initiatives are changing so frequently that they don't want to rush to engage in training. Those are all things that can cause challenges and can contribute to organizational anarchy. So we just want to do a quick poll with everyone. What are some of the red flags do you experience? We've got here frequent leadership or project ownership changes, shifting performance expectations, learners expressing confusion or disengagement, or lack of clear learning goals and or KPIs. And if there's anything else, just tell us in the chat. Again, we might take comfort knowing others are struggling with this from time to time. So as we have here, frequent leadership or product ownership changes, 100%. Yeah, that tends to come up a lot. Okay, well, at least we're in agreement with that one. I see a few people have said all of the above. But again, a lot of it is those constant shifting priorities and changes that can make it really difficult for us as L&D professionals to try and figure out where we should be allocating our time. Just if you want to take a moment to pop a couple of comments in the chat, what are some signs of what signs of organizational anarchy have you noticed during a learning project? Perhaps you were working on an L&D initiative and experienced some organizational anarchy or experienced some challenges. Perhaps you experienced something more recently. If you feel comfortable posting that in the chat, I encourage you to just to kind of see some of the different challenges that folks are having. I think sometimes it helps to know that as L&D professionals, we all encounter some of these challenges from time to time. Yeah, I'm seeing lack of or non-existent statements of purpose, outlining those key responsibilities, lack of senior leadership alignment and awareness, lack of leadership buy-in. Yeah, this is where we kind of start to see, as I'm looking at some of these, the lack of leadership buy-in, conflicting opinions with subject matter experts. Those are examples of that fluid participation and problematic preferences. Poor prioritization makes me think we've got unclear technology at play, where we don't have clear timelines and processes and protocols. And so those are things that we need to be thinking about as well. And so we have one more poll for everyone here today. On a scale of 1 to 5 being not comfortable and 5 being comfortable, how comfortable do you feel navigating organizational anarchy in your current role? So here we've got the results. We've got somewhat comfortable. I don't see anyone saying absolutely comfortable or very comfortable. My response to this, I would have given you the old instructional design response, which is it all depends, right? Anytime we're asked an instructional design question. But again, just kind of, I don't think people like to fully jump in and embrace organizational anarchy because it can be challenging. And so as we kind of go through this, we're going to kind of look at some of the different strategies that we can employ to help stabilize L&D and to stabilize our L&D initiatives amidst anarchy. So one of the first things we can be thinking about is how do we ensure stability? And I like to look at this thinking of it in terms of instructional stability, as well as the non-instructional stability. So the instructional stability is how are we prioritizing core competencies in training? And when we find that there's a lot of change going on, whenever we can tie back our L&D initiatives to durable skills, those timeless skills such as communication, critical thinking, problem solving, adaptability, that can be very helpful for us as an L&D unit. When you find that you might have those goals that are changing rapidly, and 6 months from now it might be something different, it can be really hard for us as L&D professionals to really focus in on some of those hyper-specific skills if we know that they're going to be put on the shelf and not used, or we know that there's going to be a new set of skills that we'll be asked to address. When we start thinking about the non-instructional stability, this is where I want you to think about how are you laying a good foundation to support your L&D initiatives. And this can be through how you're building relationships with different employees and leaders within your organization. This is where if you know that certain people are involved in certain conversations around strategic planning, letting them know that you exist, letting them know that L&D is there. L&D is there to help the organization and to support the organization in a variety of different ways. Sometimes I think organizational leaders might think of L&D as being more of a reactive service to the organization, where they identify a problem or a need and they ask us to develop training in response to that. But I also think that they could also look at L&D professionals in our units as being proactive, and so that we can be engaged early on when we're starting to talk about some of the different organizational challenges that may be occurring in the future. How we manage communication, thinking about what are the different ways you notify leaders and employees or customers within your organizations about your L&D initiatives, about L&D services that you can provide. This can be really helpful. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. They might not know all the different things that we can assist with or that we're able to contribute to, especially from that organizational development and planning standpoint. And then, of course, trying to anticipate those political moves. If you know that there's certain changes that are on the horizon within your organization, starting to anticipate some of the different ways in which you as an L&D unit can support some of those changes and hope to amidst some of the chaos and anarchy that may ensue. It's important that we're establishing infrastructure through stakeholder mapping, communication plans, and pulse surveys. And so one of the things that we can start thinking about is identifying and monitoring who can block, enable, or influence L&D in your organization. We all have individuals within our organizations that are cheerleaders of L&D. They see the value and utility in what we do. And you probably have some people in your organization that are like, oh, not another training, right? And so again, it's really important that we're identifying those people and thinking how we can strategically engage with them along the way. We also have communication plans. So what are those scheduled communication updates that we can provide to all of our stakeholders when different things are going on? Perhaps it's when trainings are out. Perhaps it's just-in-time trainings that are available, micro learnings to support your employees. Perhaps it's career development, succession planning, figuring out different ways in which you can schedule something to let everyone know what's available to them and how they can access it. And then, of course, pulse surveys. I think a lot of organizations engage in these pulse surveys. So being able to look at the results of that can kind of give you ideas, too, of where you can start thinking about how L&D might be able to support some of the feedback that's coming in from those surveys. Perhaps it's looking at what are some of those durable skills we were talking about earlier that people are interested in pursuing. Perhaps it's looking at what are some opportunities for L&D to support onboarding or internal mobility within your organization. Looking at I always think when I look at the pulse surveys, looking at where you might have some complaints or people might be expressing some of their frustrations with different areas. Those might be that low-hanging fruit that you might be able to help support through your L&D initiatives. And then we want to be thinking about the strategic L&D professional. And so this is where we can be looking at observing informal decision makers. This is where it's looking at who are people within your organization that have a lot of influence, that could see the value and utility of what L&D brings to the organization and can be mentioning that and can be engaging in conversations to let people know L&D could be here and could be used strategically to support those changes within the organization. I think it's being able to be that observer, anticipating alliances, anticipating rifts, and trying to figure out and trying to plan ahead of time, especially when we're trying to engage in meetings with our different stakeholders. One of the challenges that we have as L&D professionals is the problematic preferences and fluid participation. A lot of times those go hand in hand. And so we can anticipate where some of those alliances may come in. That might be a good way to celebrate a small success and how you can bring some of those individuals together, perhaps to either address some of those problematic preferences or perhaps address some of those unclear technology. Maybe we can bring together some of those alliances to brainstorm what processes and protocols are needed or can be built to support everything going on from an L&D standpoint. Building multiple lines of communication to survive leadership turnover. The worst thing is if you only have one advocate and for you, and that person leaves the organization, and then you're kind of like, well, who do I go to now? Who do I contact? Who can I share these ideas with? And so again, establishing a rapport with multiple leaders within your organization and communicating with them regularly on how L&D can support the strategic plan, how you can support the goals of your organization, can also help you along the way to navigate some of that instability when we do have those changes in leadership and organizational, perhaps hierarchies along the way. And then establishing credibility by building a brand of responsiveness and reliability inside the organization. This is something that you can own as an L&D professional that no one can take away from you. And so when you are dealing with organizational anarchy, being able to be known and respected as that L&D team that's, building that brand of responsiveness, meeting our learners where they're at, developing training that is supporting those learning goals, those learning needs, and filling those gaps in performance. That's how we establish credibility and a solid reputation over time. So one of the things I want you to think about is, can you think of a time when an unofficial influencer helped or hurt a learning initiative in your organization? Let's give everybody a moment if anyone's typing anything in the chat. Kind of talk about how we can scan our organizations and look at who are those individuals that may be good alliances for us along the way. You know, can you think about a project where someone has helped you or they've hurt it? I know for myself personally, I spent several years working in healthcare, and anytime we were doing team training with a variety of health professionals, I would intentionally want to bring, perhaps it was the curmudgeon that complained about training. Perhaps it was, someone that had been there a very long time, but was well respected. Those were the individuals that I could really help influence things when we were trying to initiate and enact change within the organization. And so recognizing who those individuals are and how they might have that unofficial influencer role can also be helpful. I'm seeing executive support to invest in a learning management system can help. Absolutely. I'm also seeing here where someone was pushing perhaps a different technology and that caused confusion and resentment. Because again, we're seeing where there's that disconnect between unclear technology and problematic preferences, right? We're seeing where there's misalignment somewhere within the organization. Yep. Sometimes we're told afterwards. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see more often than not as L&D professionals is not always being brought into some of those planning conversations where we're told after the fact. We're told after perhaps a product has been purchased. We're told this is what you have to do. Perhaps training they've already decided what the training is going to be without ever having conducted a needs assessment. And so those are different things that we have to contend with as L&D professionals. And so some of the different things that we can be thinking about, what we can do is how do we go about building a strong foundation? And so when we look at this first level here, this is where we want to make sure that we have some degree of flexibility as L&D. So as you start thinking about the different ways in which you approach your L&D projects, depending on how much time you're allocating to different projects and initiatives within your organization, being flexible, recognizing that priorities may change. If you're anticipating some organizational changes or some political changes, perhaps there's going to be some mergers and acquisitions coming up, trying to figure out ways in which L&D can be flexible to still support your organization, but be able to be responsive and to quickly adjust and pivot as needed. Ensuring clarity. And so being clear on what you're able to offer as an L&D unit. And I think oftentimes people aren't always aware or familiar with what L&D professionals do. I think we do a lot more than just designing training. So I think it's having those conversations with individuals, advocating for the work that L&D professionals do, educating people on what we do. But also letting people know all the different ways we can support organizational initiatives through those non-instructional interventions. We do both. And so I think thinking about how L&D can approach a project supporting both those instructional interventions and those non-instructional interventions is really critical to the success of a long-standing and sustainable initiative. We want to look at alignment. How can we align our L&D efforts? And so this is, having those conversations with key leaders within our organization, looking at the ways in which we can be proactive. How can we support our new strategic plans or changes to our organization? If we're engaging in those pulse surveys and we're seeing the results, do we see opportunities to support our employees? Perhaps it's career development, professional development, onboarding, any of those types of things are different ways in which we can look at how we can align our units to support other initiatives going on within the organization. And then lastly, engagement. And I think this is looking at what are the different ways in which we can engage our learners in meaningful ways. This is going to be one of those it all depends answers. How are our learners accessing content? when do they need content, and what types of content do they need, and what types of content do they crave? This is where we have that opportunity really to be honest with ourselves and think about what makes the most sense. Different instructional outcomes warrant different instructional strategies. And so really thinking about what's the intended purpose of training or these different initiatives that are going on, and then what's the best way to be able to engage those learners along the way so that we're designing something that they're going to see the relevance in, they're going to see the utility in, and they're going to keep coming back because we're establishing that brand, that reputation, that we are a credible and responsive unit that's helping our employees and our managers. I think it's looking at ways in which we can also look at how we build credibility. And so this is focusing in on some of those consistent small wins. So thinking about what are those small successes that you can share with managers. Perhaps do they have a team that's functioning very well? They've gone through training. We're starting to see those changes in performance. We're starting to see customer success. Their satisfaction scores are rising. Perhaps we're seeing fewer errors in product development. These would be considered those small wins that you can share with individual leaders and teams within your organization. I think looking at not just the way we build relationships with our stakeholders, but how do we maintain those relationships? I think that tends to be a challenge too that we have as L&D professionals. Sometimes we might feel that we're on a limited term contract with some of the people within our organization. We may be working on a design project with them and getting their feedback, but it's short term. And then once the project's done, everyone kind of just goes off on their way working on their next project. But thinking about the ways in which we can communicate and maintain those relationships with stakeholders, that also helps us with building credibility with our brand, our responsiveness, and just getting word out that L&D is there to support our organizations. We also have data storytelling, and this is where, data doesn't lie. This is where we have those opportunities to be able to tell the story of where we're seeing those consistent small wins, where we're seeing gradual improvements within our L&D initiatives. It's not always going to be this, fireworks emerge, and we all realize that, learning has happened, change has occurred, and it's all because of L&D. But it's looking at what's the gradual sequence that we're seeing, where we're starting to see a gradual improvement, perhaps in employee engagement, in performance, and what are the different ways that we can tell those stories so that people understand what those small wins are and they're able to celebrate with us along the way. So when we start thinking about what are some of those common L&D challenges that we face, and as we kind of look at what are those challenges versus what are some of the actions we can take, when if we find ourselves in that lack of leadership support, perhaps someone doesn't necessarily see the value in L&D, or they're looking at budgets and they're considering cutting budgets and they're not quite sure what L&D is bringing to the organization, or how are we contributing to that strategic plan. This is where we have that opportunity to start showing the ROI of what we do. This is where we can start thinking about what are some of the different types of data and metrics that we can gather to show that we are meeting our intended purpose. What are some of the data that we can show, in addition to other initiatives going on within the organization, to show that we're intertwined, to show that we are supporting the strategic plan, the strategic goals within our organization. If we find that we just have employee burnout or employee resistance, perhaps people don't want to go through training. They may be hesitant if they're being asked to try something new. This is where we can kind of start looking at ways in which we could offer customized learning paths. This is where we can look at if we have employees that are coming in with a certain level of experience and expertise, being able to recognize that and perhaps put them on a unique and customized learning path that acknowledges that and helps them to continue to build and refine particular skills that perhaps they've identified in partnership with their supervisor or manager. That's another way to help employees see the value and the utility of what L&D can bring to the organization. If you find that if you have a limited budget, which I find that happens from time to time, that's a pretty common challenge for L&D teams to face, looking at what are some of those different cost-effective tools. And so it could be looking at ways in which we can engage in rapid prototyping. What are some of the tools we can use for micro learnings? How are we going to communicate and have a consistent approach to how we're designing and delivering training? And then lastly, a challenge that I think, and I've seen this pop up in the chat today, looking at those siloed departments. And when we find ourselves working in an organization that has a lot of silos, or we're trying to navigate that, looking at ways in which we can implement cross-functional learning programs. Too often I hear organizations say that they want to tout it in their strategic plan that they are a learning organization. But to truly be able to do that, they need to be thinking about the ways in which L&D can support that infrastructure within the organization, and implementing those cross-functional learning programs can help. This is where we're bringing multiple stakeholders, multiple leaders to the table to engage in these conversations, to identify what are the goals and skills we really want to be focusing in on at that time. That helps to mitigate some of the challenges that we tend to experience with regards to problematic preferences, fluid participation, as well as the unclear technology. Sometimes with fluid participation, we don't have all of the people involved that we need to have involved. And so by implementing and engaging in these cross-functional discussions and these cross-functional learning programs, that can help mitigate and alleviate some of those challenges. And then lastly, it's looking at what are the different ways we can create an actionable plan. So if you're sitting here today and you're thinking, I deal with organizational anarchy, perhaps you're saying I deal with it all the time. Maybe you're saying I deal with it sometimes. But of course, anytime we're dealing with it, there is that level of it's uncomfortable. And we don't like change. We typically, we're not big fans of change when it's requiring ambiguity and uncertainty. And so my goal for today is that you can kind of start thinking about what are the ways in which you can create an actionable plan to help yourself. And so one of the ways that you can do this is surveying the landscape. And so this could be beginning by assessing the level of anarchy and identifying pockets of stability versus instability. And this analysis lays the groundwork for building a case for incremental action. For those of you that have joined in on any other webinars, I don't think it would be a Litmos webinar with me if I didn't say, where's the needs assessment, right? But this is that opportunity to identify, like, where are we at today? What's working well? And where are we seeing some gaps in performance? Where are we seeing some of that instability? And this also helps us look at and identify what makes the most sense at this given time with the resources that we currently have. And perhaps it allows for some discussion to happen with, if we're going to address some of these pockets of instability, what resources do we need to have in place as we're moving forward? Looking at the different ways in which we can select our L&D tools and strategies. And a lot of this is based on, being realistic, being pragmatic. What are the available resources that we currently have? What are the realities? What's the size of your L&D team? For some of you may have a couple of colleagues that you're working with. Other people on this call might be saying, it's just me. But again, depending on what those resources are and what your timelines are, being realistic about that is also going to help you in terms of how you create that action plan, and then how you can go about having conversations around that action plan as you're explaining why you may or may not be able to do certain things within your organization at the time something's requested. I think it's looking at, what does risk tolerance look like? How much flexibility is your organization giving you to try different things? And so I've seen where some organizations are very prescriptive with the types of training and the types of materials that they want to see delivered to their employees or to their learners. Others may be a little bit more flexible and we'll say willing to explore some different strategies, some different activities. But again, it's being realistic about what's the current temperature look like within your organization. If you're finding that you're wanting to change some of that risk tolerance and you're hoping to improve upon a few things, establishing those multiple lines of communication with multiple leaders within your organization can help to get some of those conversations moving forward for you. And then lastly, thinking about organizational goals. If you were to kind of map out all the different instruction that you've done or that you're getting ready to work on, could you look today and look at your current training programs you're designing or about to deliver and say, how can you map that back to one of your organization's goals? That's a good way too to kind of help to look at how are you navigating organizational ambiguity. If you find that something that's being designed and delivered to your employees or your learners doesn't align with the organizational goals, then that's something where you might want to go back and have some conversations with leadership to, again, address that. Perhaps it's due to the problematic preferences. Perhaps it's due to not having sufficient participation and trying to address those challenges that we encounter with fluid participation. And then lastly, really looking at how do we lay the foundation for new initiatives? So again, this is where brand recognition is really important. We really want to sell ourselves as L&D professionals and let people know about the brand and the reputation we have within our organization. So publicizing successes, thinking about how are you communicating to all of your stakeholders within your organization when there is a success that can be attributed to L&D, or when your learners are doing something that's noteworthy. This goes back to publicizing those successes with your stakeholders, but it also goes back to what data are you going to use to tell that story, to be able to celebrate those short-term wins, those quick wins within the organization. When you find that you're dealing with some of these new initiatives, thinking about what are the ways in which you can iterate fast. So what types of rapid prototyping can you use? What types of storyboarding or wireframing might be helpful if you find that you're getting ready to launch a new L&D initiative? What are the ways that you can gather feedback from stakeholders really quickly, make those necessary refinements to your training materials, and continue to move forward? And so thinking about the ways in which you can engage in small scale testing. If you think about iterating fast and iterating often, then sometimes that means we don't have to worry about things getting lost on the shelf or being delayed for an extended period of time. If we know that, we need to get it good enough to be able to have it launched, we can always continue to make those refinements as we're gathering feedback, as long as we're putting sufficient feedback loops into that design to gather feedback from stakeholders as well as our learners. And then scaling it up. So thinking about this, it doesn't have to be perfect that first time around, but the ways in which we can scale up our L&D efforts is building those internal partnerships, looking at the ways that we can layer programs onto existing structures. Are there other initiatives that are going on within our organization where we can team up with those departments or those initiatives as L&D? Are there certain initiatives that are going on where change is occurring? And perhaps training can be used to help that. Perhaps it's that just-in-time learning. It's the micro learnings to let people know, as refreshers if certain changes are coming up over an extended period of time. And then also being able to be ready to pivot or pause. And I think that this helps the more we're able to successfully build those internal partnerships and engage in those conversations. If we're linking everything that we're doing to organizational goals, that also helps us be able to identify when we might need to pivot or pause, as well as when we have to start talking about prioritizations. I saw in the chat earlier, someone was mentioning a challenge that they had encountered was there was multiple opinions going on about prioritizing different needs within the organization. And so if we're engaging in those conversations about how our efforts are supporting the strategic plan or our strategic goals, that can help us with prioritizing, where do we need to pivot or pause with certain projects along the way. And then evaluate and adjust. This is where we're going to be looking at ways in which we can integrate regular pulse checks, looking at are we meeting that intended purpose, figuring out ways we can use continuous feedback loops, not just with the training materials that we're delivering, but with the non-instructional interventions. So if you're thinking about how you're going to build relationships with different leaders, maintain or improve lines of communication with various stakeholders within your organization, these are all different ways in which we can gather lots of feedback along the way, which also helps us with our storytelling and being able to explain how L&D is contributing to the ROI of our organization's strategic goals. And then again, not being afraid to have to redefine success metrics as needed. Organizations change. And so as initiatives change, as priorities change, it's really important from time to time that you're looking at what are our success metrics? What does this look like? Are they still prevalent with what we have going on within our organization, and being able to pivot and adjust along the way to make sure that we are gathering or that we are identifying metrics that are really going to help us ensure that we are meeting that intended purpose, that we are contributing successfully to those organizational goals along the way. I know we had a lot of stuff crammed into a short amount of time, but I'm just going to see if there's any questions along the way.
I don't know. Did you want me to hop on and try to?
If you don't mind, Liz, that would be fantastic.
Quite a few. I think actually this is an appropriate one because you were just talking about feedback loops and assessment and pulse surveys. So one of the attendees was asking, they said, I love the idea of pulse surveys, but what do you do when there's already survey fatigue?
I think that's where it's really looking at the ways that L&D can hop on and support existing initiatives. So perhaps it's looking at what data has already been gathered. You don't want to just create a survey for the sake of creating a survey, or you don't want to say, well, even though HR did one, even though customer service did one, or the employee development did one, L&D is going to do one. So I think is there data that you can use that would provide you with information to see how L&D might be able to support some of those challenges or ideas that are being conveyed.
And we just got another one along the same lines around fatigue. Mm-hmm. How do you fight the emotional or morale drain on a team amidst organizational anarchy?
I think it can be helpful when you're engaging in conversations with your stakeholders about how L&D could be able and could be willing to support some of the different changes that are coming into place. There's lots of different ways that trainings can be used to support change within an organization. I think, but with that comes a need for communication, especially when there's a lot of changes. People, usually when there's a lot of organizational changes, there's a lot of organizational uncertainty and ambiguity, and people get nervous or frustrated because of all those unknowns. And I'm going to go back to my needs assessment stuff. From a needs assessment standpoint, from a learner analysis standpoint, if we're not feeling safe or comfortable, it's very difficult for us to be able to engage in learning and enact change. And so it's thinking about the ways in which us as L&D professionals, we can support that change. And with that's going to come a lot of conversation and communication, and really kind of surveying what the landscape has looked like within your organization. How has L&D been used in the past? We want people to see L&D as being a proactive solution. We don't want them to think that it's a checkbox that they're just required to do every couple of months. We don't want them to think that training is punitive, like my boss is making me go through training. I don't have the time for it. But if people can see that value and they see that L&D is listening and trying to come up with solutions and materials that will support them, that can also help with some of that fatigue and employee engagement.
That's a great answer. You got a lot of heart reacts on that one. I think that resonated with our audience. And along those lines, sort of finding the support within your organization to make L&D proactive rather than reactive. One of the questions we got was they wanted your recommendations for identifying influencers in a remote first environment where casual or like unplanned exchanges aren't possible. You don't have the water cooler conversations. Mm-hmm. You don't have the opportunity to casually mention your L&D wins. So how do you get those influencers on board in a remote first environment?
I think it's recognizing that takes time. Time is a variable that we can't always rush with certain initiatives. And so I think that recognizing that we don't have the luxury of walking into someone's office and interrupting them or hanging out by the water cooler or the break room. I think it's recognizing that those things take time to establish relationships, but I definitely think that it's doable. I think it's, listening in on some of those different meetings that you're in. It's going to some of those open forums your organization may be having and listening to who's speaking, who's asking questions. That's a great way to be able to find some common ground with others within your organization and to gain a better understanding of what they're prioritizing or what they're concerned with. but it does take time. And I think that just going into that, knowing that it's not something that you're going to be able to overcome and address, within a matter of days. It takes time. It takes several of those meetings and initiatives.
Absolutely. Yeah. And coming from a remote first environment, which Litmos is, we're well acquainted with that. Yes. And someone in the chat says using Teams chat is a great way to advertise. And that's definitely
absolutely
true. Yeah. Shout it from the rooftops via Teams or Slack or whatever messenger your organization uses. And to your point about timing and how these things sort of take time, we do have a question from someone who's newer to their L&D department at their company, and they're wondering what are some of the early signs that our L&D program might be too rigid to adapt to future workplace changes.
I think one way to kind of look at it is looking at what are some of those strategic goals that may be in place with your organization. How much time is being allocated to accomplish those goals? When you look at a typical strategic plan, you're going to see those short-term successes, those short-term goals, and perhaps those more long-standing goals where your organization's recognizing it's going to take some time to be able to do that. If you find that as you're kind of looking at the content that you've designed and say, is this going to be obsolete? Are you designing training knowing that there's a new initiative that's coming down the way? Are you designing product training and knowing the product's going to look completely different, 2 months from now or a couple of weeks from now? That might show that it's rigid, depending on the size of your organization and the need for that training in the first place. So when you're starting to look at, durability, what are some of those? I always like to say, what are some of those skills that are going to be timeless that people are going to see the value in, that they can they last for a year? Can they last for, if an employee engaged with their manager or supervisor on their annual review and they were talking about training opportunities, will they think that those training opportunities that are currently being presented to them make sense? Are they relevant to what they do a year from now? And I think that that's a good way to kind of get started.
Yeah, and that sort of ties back to the beginning of the presentation when you're talking about focusing on those skills, those durable skills, to kind of make your L&D a little more future-proof. Not that anything can be 100% future-proof, but yeah. I think we have one last question about leadership buy-in. How can we get leadership buy-in for non-instructional solutions, especially when the leadership, prefer traditional training approaches?
I don't think that it's getting rid of the traditional training approaches, but I think it's letting leadership know how L&D can support those non-instructional solutions. And so I've talked to too many L&D professionals over the years where there was, they designed great training and no one knew about it, or no one knew how to access it, or no one thought about who were the learners that were going to access it? How were they going to access it? And so I think it's thinking about what are those communication plans? If you want to, kind of generate some excitement within your organization or amidst your learners for a new initiative coming and saying, and this is how L&D can support this. What are the ways you're going to get that information out to people? Those are all examples of the non-instructional. How are you engaging and gathering feedback? How are you establishing those feedback loops? Not just from knowledge checks and things you might gather from training modules, but what types of informal feedback are you getting from around the water cooler, perhaps the virtual water cooler, depending on where you work? But what types of informal feedback are you getting from employees or managers and supervisors when they're talking about L&D efforts within your organization?
I think that's a great way to cap off this discussion. We are coming up at the end of the hour, so I just wanted to thank everyone in the chat and watching live for joining us. We really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to have this discussion with us, and we hope that we inspired each of you to build strong, resilient learning programs for your organization. I wanted to give a special thanks to you, Dr. Stefaniak, for speaking with us today. And just a quick reminder, this presentation, it was recorded, so we'll be making that available to you via the email you registered with. So yeah, any closing thoughts, Dr. Stefaniak?
I would just say, just continue to recognize that organizational chaos is inherent in the work that we do as L&D professionals, and try to find small ways in which you can embrace that chaos. And I think having an action plan, looking at those small successes first, can help us do just that, as well as keep our sanity along the way. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.